A lot of games have a system where you're told you're good or you're bad. Maybe not necessarily good or bad, but compassionate and ruthless. And they do it in different ways, be it in a little readout that tells you the implications of your actions or what you've said, or perhaps a bar for good and bad. This means that the developers have to go through, as they're making the game, and impose on each and every action whether the action is good or bad. Well, allow me to do a little imposing of my own here. That's bad. Now, for some games, it's alright. Here's a screen from KOTOR, Knights of the Old Republic. Star Wars is a universe in which it's established that there is a good and bad, and it's quantifiable. People decide what is good and what is bad, and it affects their character inwardly. The dark side is very real, and what dictates whether you're part of it is purely where you are on the moral spectrum. The moral spectrum is a part of the world. But for other games, for example Mass Effect, this moral spectrum is not part of the world. It's a stapled-on appendage to incorporate your character's supposed morality into the mechanics of a game. So let's look at where role-playing games started. Around a table with your friends in your mother's basement. I'm talking dice and pencils. Back in tabletop role-playing game days, morality was more complex than good and bad. It wasn't a spectrum of just good and bad, but two spectrums. I've already got the whole nerd thing going on here, so let's add to it with some maths. Here's a Cartesian grid. There's an x-axis and a y-axis. On the y-axis, we have good and evil. This is usually where video games get to. They don't get to the x-axis. Lawful and chaotic. Morality in tabletop role-playing games isn't just whether you're good or bad, but how much of a jerk you are while being good or bad. Paragon and Renegade aren't good and bad in Mass Effect, they're lawful good and chaotic good most of the time. Sometimes Renegade is just plain racist and Paragon is space Jesus, as it were. In theory, each action in a game lies somewhere on this grid. Morality is quantified. An action could be given a place on a grid, a number, a set of coordinates that tell us its morality. A lot of people disagree with this notion that some actions are justifiable to one person but not to another, and that no one has the right to say whether something is good or bad. It's arguable that morality isn't objective, but subjective. So let's look at what makes an action moral. This is a subject of some debate, but I'm going to go with this guy. Immanuel Kant was a German philosopher who came up with a few pretty good ideas. Kant had a deontological theory, which means that he believed morality could be defined according to a rule, a moral law, which he called the categorical imperative. There are two kinds of imperative in Kantian ethics, the hypothetical and the categorical. The hypothetical imperative is an imperative you are free to disregard at times. An imperative is a command, so, for example, if you are bored, play video games. If you're not bored, so no one watching this video, you do not need to play video games and therefore can disregard the command. However, the categorical imperative is universal. For example, don't kick puppies. Even if you want to kick puppies, you must not kick puppies. If you do, you have committed an immoral action. The categorical imperative is like a check for an action to pass. If it does, it is moral. If it doesn't, it's immoral. We now need to define the categorical imperative, because don't kick puppies is a little vague and doesn't really fit our requirements. Kant said the categorical imperative must be a rule on which you must always be willing to act, would want others to act on it as well, and must not be made exceptions for. Essentially, no takesies backsies and everyone's got to do it. We're coming back to games in a moment. Allow me one more tangent. We've sorted out the morality of an action, something that follows the categorical imperative, but not the morality of a person. Kant said the morality of a person is not dictated by the consequences of their actions, but by their motivations. He illustrated this through the story of the thirsty man. The thirsty man is locked in a room with a bottle of water. He follows the hypothetical imperative of, if I am thirsty, I must drink water if I can. He lives by the categorical imperative of, I will do unto others what I would want done to me. This means that if someone has more need for something than he does, he will give it to them. Another man is put in the room. The dying man. He is dying of dehydration. The thirsty man, according to his hypothetical imperative, knows that drinking water will solve the dying man's thirst, and to fulfill his categorical imperative, he gives the man the bottle of water. The dying man drinks it all, but chokes on the last sip and dies. The dying man died as a result of the thirsty man's actions, which could be seen as immoral, but as the thirsty man fulfilled the categorical imperative, his intentions were moral, and therefore he is immoral. Okay, games. What defines an action's morality isn't what the developers say, but rather what the player intended to happen as a result of their actions, or rather their character's actions. Well, how do games measure intention without specifically understanding the player's thought process? They don't, and they shouldn't even try. The player should be left to decide the morality of their own actions for themselves. The Witcher, for example, makes it a point not to tell you which action is right or wrong, and largely leaves it up to you to decide. It's not a question of what the game developers think is right or wrong, but a question of what the player thinks is right or wrong. That is my gripe with a system like the dialogue wheel. You're sectioned off into good, bad, sarcastic or neutral, and question, whereas the details are far more complex and not as easily quantified. It achieves very little all in all because people don't react to the overall morality of a person, but rather their actions and opinions on their actions. If someone pulls the life support plug on someone in a coma, some may agree with their decision as it ends their potential suffering, and some may disagree as they may believe life is to be prolonged for as long as possible. Either view is acceptable. It's not anyone's job to say which is right. So, if a dialogue wheel were to do something like this, it's sort of telling you where the game developers stand, isn't it? If you're trying to play a good character, as it were, you wouldn't want to pick the option you necessarily believe in or want your character to pick, but the top one, because that's what the game thinks is good. The dialogue wheel is then didactic. It tells you what is right and wrong, and you can't really avoid doing so with dialogue wheel. A system like this, I believe, is far better, as it doesn't tell you what to pick, and the player can decide the morality of a certain choice for themselves. Games revolve around choice to define a character, be it action or dialogue. You can define an action's morality, but you can't measure it, and games don't need to even try to. Players can do that for themselves.